If you have your Bibles, we're going to be in the book of Daniel. You can go ahead and turn there. Now, you can turn to Daniel chapter 1, and we're going to spend most of our time in Daniel chapter 3. And while you're turning there, we all find ourselves in situations and seasons of life that end up being a lot harder than we anticipated them to be. For example, earlier this past week, Rachel and I and our friend Chandler, we went over to the Maces for dinner. And before we ate dinner, Luke, their youngest son, sitting right here on the front row, oddly enough, challenged me to a game of chess. And they're all like, oh, he's really good. I'm like, all right, yeah, okay. Because I'm one of these guys, okay? It's my personal conviction that you don't just let kids win, okay? They need to learn how to lose well, and what it takes to win. Now, that's just me and my personal conviction when it comes to children and competition. However, I realized that I was in trouble whenever this child takes my queen in like the first 4 moves. And then the longer the game goes on, the more I realize this isn't getting any better for me. And before I know it, all of my pieces are gone except for my king. And Johnny can attest to it. I'm just running my king all over this board, just trying not to lose. Now, I'm thinking in my head, all right, maybe I can play this off like I'm just letting the kid win, but I'm pretty sure they know me better than that. And eventually, the game ends in a stalemate, to which they said worked in my favor, because technically I didn't lose. But in my mind, I'm looking at this board. He's got more pieces left than I do. I'm the one who can't move, so if I'm honest with myself, I just lost to a 5-year-old in chess. And of course, he sits right here in the front row to rub it in my face even more today. But he might be a genius 5-year-old, but it wasn't supposed to go that way. It wasn't supposed to be that hard. And I think so often that's a lot what life can be like, where we think that things are going in our favor, the odds are stacked for us, but then we get blindsided by difficulty. Or we may have an idea or know in our minds that things are going to be difficult at some point, but whenever we find ourselves in the situation, it is so much more difficult than we ever could have expected it to be. You see, in the book of Daniel, I can't imagine what life could have been like for these Hebrew teenage boys. I think we read over passages sometimes without actually appreciating the reality of what happened in these historical accounts. In verse 1 of chapter 1, it says that King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon came to Jerusalem and besieged it. Imagine it. Their home country is raided by a foreign power. They kill their king. They wipe out all of their leadership, and then they start raiding city after city, town after town, home after home, until they end up on your doorstep. You try your best to defend your home, but there's nothing that you can really do. Dads, they kill you first. Moms, they kill you or worse. And if they deem the kids worth keeping around, they put them into captivity and send them off to their home country to be assimilated into their society and their way of life. Now, all this is happening to Israel because they had abandoned God and his commandments. And the people had been warned. The prophet Jeremiah, we talked about this 3 weeks ago, the prophet Jeremiah begged them for 23 years to turn back to God, but they refused because they were caught up thinking that no matter what, they were still God's people. They had bought into false teachers that told them that things weren't going to be difficult, bad things weren't going to happen to them. Everything was stacked in their favor. Everything was going to be okay. But it wasn't okay. And when the besieging began, they had to be thinking, this isn't the way things are supposed to go. Things aren't supposed to be this hard. But like we talked about a few weeks ago, even throughout this exile, God was determined to keep a remnant for himself, preserve his people so that he could one day bring true salvation into the world through his son, Jesus. And we see a piece of this remnant in the beginning of the book of Daniel in 4 teenage boys. Daniel, who Pastor Skip talked about the week before last, and today I want to focus on the other 3 guys. We have Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, more famously referred to as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, or Benny for the VeggieTales fans. And as we go on to read, These were guys who loved God, who followed his commandments, who followed him. But yet they were still ripped from their homes, probably watched their parents get executed, and lived through traumatic experiences that we couldn't even fathom. And then they were dragged off to live in the home country of those who destroyed their homes and their families. Is God still good? That's a question we all have asked or will have to ask at some point whenever our lives are seemingly being torn apart. Is God still good? I've heard it said that throughout life, you're either in the fire, coming out of the fire, or going into the fire. And when we find ourselves in those situations, we'll be asking, is God good? Does he care? Is he here? Is he listening? And we may be praying nonstop for God to deliver us, to come through, to make things better. But what if he doesn't? What if the diagnosis stays the same? What if the relationship still falls apart? What if the finances still aren't coming together? What if you still lose the loved one? Will we still claim to believe what we claim to believe? See, I think it's really important to note that these teenage boys are remembered most for how they handled themselves and the way they lived during the most difficult seasons of their lives. They were in a foreign nation, their families killed and torn apart, and yet they were determined to stand firm. And the Babylonians were trying to change everything about them. They want to assimilate them into their culture. They want to change the way they think. They want to change the way that they worship. They want to change the way they see the world. They want to change the way they see themselves. And so one of the first things they do is they change their names. And in verse 7 of Daniel 1, it says the chief of staff renamed them with these Babylonian names. Hananiah was called Shadrach, Mishael was called Meshach, and Azariah was called Abednego. Now, this is significant whenever you look at what these names mean. Now, these guys' original Hebrew names meant God has favored. Who is what God is? Jehovah has helped. Now, these names, what they identified themselves by was based around who God is and what he has done. So the Babylonians want to change all of that. And so they changed their names to these Babylonian names with different meanings that mean the great scribe, guest of a king, servant or worshiper of Nebo or Mercury, a Babylonian god. And so really what they're trying to do is shift the way they identify and define themselves from who God is and what he has done to their occupation, status, different religion. Now this is important because how you define yourself determines where you find your hope. I'll say it this way. How you choose to define yourself will determine where you find your hope. If you choose to define yourself by your occupation or what you do, you'll constantly live in fear of failure because if you lose your job, then you lose who you are. If you choose to define yourself by your social status or who you surround yourself with, you operate out of insecurity because you feel like if you don't show people exactly what you think they want to see, then they won't want to be around you anymore and you'll be a nobody. If you choose to define yourself by religion more than a relationship with God, you'll constantly be on this seesaw of pride and despair because who you are and your status with God will be based upon your performance. You see, a focus on religion is all about doing more good things and less bad things in order to try to gain favor with God. And you'll be riding high whenever you're doing good, but you'll be crushed whenever you fall. You see, when we focus on the religious aspect more than the relationship, we'll fall into this endless attempt of trying to live a certain way in order to try to get God or gods to act a certain way. And this is so easy to fall into. And that's why you see it so much over in Scripture. And the Israelites, they were trying to choose their own gods. They want to go after whatever they want to go after. And even today, why you see people going all these different kinds of faith journey, trying to pick and choose what God they want to believe in. Because deep inside, we know that there is a higher power. We know there is a true source of life beyond ourselves, but we want it to be convenient for us. We want it to fit in whatever God or whatever religion we choose to serve. We want it to fit in with my wants and my desires. And this is so easy to fall into, even in Christianity. It's so easy to buy into a cheap version of the gospel that's so prevalently sold, and it has been for generations, but it's nothing but a works-based religion. And it says that if you just pray enough, if you just believe enough, if you have the right amount of faith, if you just give enough, you'll be healed. Your bank account will be full. Things will get easier. But that's nothing but a performance-based religion, because it's stating that if I do the right things, if I say the right prayers, if I have the right amount of faith, then I can cause God to act in my favor. But what if he doesn't? That'll lead people to a dark place of despair, because they've been taught a version of Christianity that has nothing to do with knowing God and building a relationship with him, but rather getting something from him. However, if we can shift our focus from trying to define ourselves by what we can do and rather define ourselves by who God is and what he has done, I know that he is Almighty Creator God who made us in his image. And he sent his son Jesus to this planet to die on a cross and raise from a grave so that you could live in a relationship with him. That's what defines who you are. A child of God, an image bearer of the Creator himself. You can lose a job. People come and go. Religious performance is futile, but God never changes. He's the same yesterday, today, and forever. He's the great I am, because everything I'm not, he is. He's the beginning, he's the end, he's everything in between. And he has promised to never leave you and never forsake you. So even when your circumstance changes, he doesn't. Even when you feel 1,000,000 miles away from him, he has never left you. Therefore, if I choose to define myself by who God is and what he has done, then no matter what circumstance life throws at my way, I still have hope, because I know that's only temporary, but he lasts forever. Somehow, some way, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego got this. The Babylonians could change their names. They could call them whatever they wanted to call them, but they knew what they were defined by. They knew that who God is and what he has done defined them, and it was going to set the tone for every situation they encountered. To give a little more context, in chapter 1, they entered into this 3-year training period where they were educated to learn everything about everything in Babylon. And at the end of this training period, no one impressed the king more than Daniel and these 3 guys. Now in chapter 2, the king has this disturbing dream, and it messes with his head so much that he calls all of his magicians and enchanters and sorcerers and astrologers and tells them that he needs his dream interpreted. And they say, yeah, of course, your majesty, tell us your dream. We'll tell you whatever it means. And then the king says, but if you're wrong, and if you just tell me what you think I want to hear, I'll kill all of you. And they start backpedaling real quick. And they say, no one can really interpret dreams. Only gods can do that. And then Nebuchadnezzar gets so annoyed with them that he orders all the wise men in Babylon be executed. Now that includes Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and Daniel. But the Bible says that Daniel handles himself with wisdom and discretion. And he asks for more time to interpret the dream. And so Daniel goes to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They get together and they start praying that God would give them the interpretation to the king's dream. God answers their prayer, and Daniel interprets the dream for the king, and the king is so pleased with Daniel that at the end of chapter 2, it says in verse 48, then the king appointed Daniel to a high position and gave him many valuable gifts. He made Daniel ruler over the whole province of Babylon, as well as chief over all his wise men. And at Daniel's request, the king appointed Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to be in charge of all the affairs of the province of Babylon, while Daniel remained in the king's court. So things are starting to look up. Now they're still living in a foreign nation, working for the people who killed their families, but they're making the most of it. And then in chapter 3, King Nebuchadnezzar is feeling himself a little bit more than usual. And he orders that a big gold statue of himself be set up. The statue was 90 feet tall, it was 9 feet wide, and was placed in a position where everybody could see it. And the orders are that whenever you hear the music playing, everyone, no matter what you're doing or where you are, has to bow and worship this statue. And verse 7 says, so at the sound of the musical instruments, that all the people, whatever their race or nation or language, bowed to the ground and worshiped the gold statue King Nebuchadnezzar set up. Now, There are certain guys who know what Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego stood for, and they know that there's no way that they were going to worship a statue, so they go and inform on them to the king. And they tell the king, hey, there are these guys out here that refuse to worship your gods and refuse to bow to your statue. And then Nebuchadnezzar flies into a rage, and he orders that they be brought to him. In verse 15, he says, I will give you one more chance to bow down and worship the statue I made when you hear the musical instruments. But if you refuse, you'll be thrown immediately into the blazing furnace. And then what God will be able to rescue you from my power. You know, the enemy will always give you opportunities to compromise. And in that moment, it would have been very easy to, if we're in that situation. We could say, hey, all right, well, I'll just bow and give him what he wants to see, but then in my mind, I'll just pray to my God. Or, hey, we'll just do exactly what he says, and then we'll go back and pray for forgiveness later. But that's not what Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were about. And in verse 16, they say to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we don't need to defend ourselves before you. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God whom we serve is able to save us. He will rescue us from your power. But even if he doesn't, we want to make it clear to you that we will never serve your gods or worship the gold statue you set up. Then Nebuchadnezzar's face gets distorted with rage, and he orders that the furnace be set 7 times hotter than it originally was. And the account states that the fire was so hot that whenever Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are thrown into this fire, that the guards who threw them in died instantly because of the heat. Now, before we get to what happened in the fire, I want to take a minute to appreciate the answer Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego gave whenever they were faced with the ultimatum. They say, we don't have to defend ourselves before you because we know our God is able to deliver us. He will deliver us. Can also be translated, he's willing to deliver us. But even if he doesn't, we will not compromise our faith in him. He's still good. You see, I'm not saying that God never miraculously intervenes. I know what God is capable of. I know he's able to do far more than I could ever ask or imagine. And he's not just able, he's willing to. He wants to. And I could tell you story after story about miraculous physical healings that I've personally seen and ways that I've seen him supernaturally deliver. But I've also seen times when he didn't heal. I've also seen times where he didn't deliver the way that we were asking for. And that's when I have to trust in his sovereignty. And God's sovereignty, by definition, is God's absolute right to do all things according to his will. And what God wills and what God wants more than anything else is for people to know him. See, God is less concerned with giving us a more comfortable mortal life than he is with healing our eternal soul. And I have to trust that he knows how to do that better than I do. So if we're going to take a true stand of faith whenever we're faced with the fire, I believe our response should be, God is able, he will, but even if he doesn't, I trust him because he's good. Now we have a video that we've prepared for you today with 2 real-life examples of fires that people within our church have lived through whenever God didn't deliver the way that we would have asked for. Go ahead and take a look.
So Patrick and I were high school sweethearts, and we started dating when we were 16, and we dated all through high school, and then I went to Argentina for my first year of college, and he stayed here in the States. And so when I got back after that year, we kind of, went our separate ways. So we didn't talk at all pretty much for 5 entire years. And then he randomly messaged me on Facebook, and he was like, hey, I see you're in Greensboro. I come through there for work. We should catch up. It was like completely out of the blue. 6 months after that, we were engaged, and 6 months later, we were married. So kind of a crazy, movie story, when you get back with your high school sweetheart. I was pregnant with Addie when we moved to Gastonia, and so we had her in July of 2014. We were, I know this sounds like super cheesy, but we really were so super happy. We had a great life. Not a lot of arguments, things like that. So in November of 2015, Patrick and my brother-in-law and his two brothers ran a Spartan race. So they had kind of done this whole trifecta of races, and they were on this last leg, like this crazy 12-mile long obstacle course. And so, they got through the race. They were on the way home, and I called him, and I was like, hey, I'm gonna give Addie a bath, so I might not be available. I just wanted to see, where you guys are. So I was told that just a couple minutes later, he said, I don't feel well, and just kind of fell over in the car. I mean, obviously I can think back and remember that day so vividly. And when we were driving on the way to the hospital, and my sister called my dad, and my dad just looked at me, I was in the passenger seat and he was driving. And he said, baby girl, he didn't make it. Sorry. He had an aneurysm in his brain, apparently, that we didn't know, obviously didn't know was there. And so it burst just as a result of him doing that race. So it was completely sudden, and he wasn't unhealthy. You can't run a 12-mile obstacle course and be unhealthy. So it was really just crazy. Just a widow and a single mom at that point.
How old was Addie at the time?
She was 16 months old.
So addiction has been a problem in my family for a long time. And my dad actually played a pivotal role in my recovery and my sobriety. I joined the military, got married, and when I got out of the military, I went through a divorce at the same time, and my life fell apart, and I very quickly went back to what I knew made me feel good, and the way I had coped with things for a long time, I went back to it, and then before I knew it, I was homeless and had burnt every bridge that I had in my life, and really had nobody in my corner anymore, I thought. And I got to the point where I just figured out killing myself would be easier than going on. Went and tried to do it and just couldn't do it. And walked back in this truck stop and called my dad and just said, I give up. I can't live like this anymore, and I'm not promising that I can do treatment, but I need help, and I'm willing to try it. He told me, he said, if you'll go do this, and if you'll complete it, your family will come behind you and help you in any way that you need. And he was faithful with that. And I completed treatment and moved to Shelby, and Dad helped me get on my feet and get life going again. And here I am almost 7 years later, sober, living for the Lord, and life's completely changed. Dad kind of rolled this roller coaster of addiction and sobriety for a long time. When it was time for me to get sober, or when I called Dad and just said I give up, I need help, he was sober at the time. Got home, and then very quickly we switched roles because I was on this new trajectory, and he was kind of in this old rut again that he had been in. I detoxed him a couple times from pain pills very early while I was here. And he had been showing some signs of psychosis, and we all thought it was drug related. When his bottom fell out, I took him to the treatment facility that I had been at. He completed the program that I completed. That's a great mystery to me, why I'm delivered and my dad is in a grave. That's a mystery to me. I have no idea.
Grief is weird. It's like, I'd have days where I just couldn't do any, I just felt I was in such a dark place. So I definitely had times where I was like, why though? What's the point of this? There's not gonna be a reason on this side of heaven for someone 29 years old suddenly dying and leaving a widow and a baby. It's not logical.
Yeah, losing my dad's the hardest thing I've ever been through. It's hard. It's hard every day. His birthday was last week, and although it's not a day where I sat around and cried and was in the state of mind that I was a couple days after he died, it's still a day where I feel the full weight of the pain of him not being here. I actually thought the other day that I'm not sure this is a weight that ever goes away.
I've learned a lot of misconceptions that I had about God and faith and how he works. And now I feel a lot more, I guess, to use the same word, I feel a lot more grounded in knowing who God is and that he can and will bring us through even the most, difficult circumstances.
I can just tell you what I did, and that was I leaned into God harder than I ever had. And you can ask, what does that look like? What do you mean lean into God? And it's just, I wasn't fake with him. When I hurt, I cried with him and told him I hurt. And when I wasn't hurting, I didn't try and make myself feel like I was hurting.
I think the biggest thing for me was just being completely honest with God, sharing all those grief moments, not trying to, be some perfect spiritual person that, oh, God is sovereign. I'm happy this happened. No, I'm not. God is sovereign and he is working even though you don't feel like it. But sometimes you have to acknowledge you don't feel like it.
I think I would be lying if I said that I never questioned what was going on or I never asked why. That'd be a lie. I'm sitting at the funeral for Dad, and I don't know why I had this thought, but I thought, do you really believe that? Do you really believe God's good every day? You said it in here in front of everybody. Do you still believe it's true? And the song, The Goodness of God, was being sang when I had that thought. It's the first time I'd ever heard it. And, I came to the conclusion that, yeah, I still believe it.
God kind of showed up in little small ways, and then there were these grand gestures that you're like, wow, that could only have been God. But so somebody sent a blanket that they had made, and it arrived at my house on our anniversary. So it was exactly 6 months after he had passed. And they didn't have a name on it or anything. I didn't know who it was at first. But I had been thinking about and, praying for God to wrap me up. That's what I needed. I just wanted to be wrapped up in him. Because I just felt sometimes so out of control. And so, that was such a perfect, visual representation of that desire of my heart, that I had been needing.
We as Americans very rarely experience God, the Holy Spirit, as the comforter because we create our own comfort. We save up wealth and create a comfortable life, and very rarely do we need God to help us carry things. And I remember a couple weeks after Dad died, I had this not an epiphany, but just this, God brought this to my mind that I'm carrying this with you, because I thought, man, I have no idea how I'm carrying this and still praising God for who he is and still saying he's good and still claiming he's good to my friends. And I thought, how am I doing? And then it hit me what Seth said. I'm like, it's because I'm experiencing the Comforter. Jesus didn't claim that we wouldn't go through it, but he claimed and promised that he would be with us through it.
But until you're there and you're going through it, and he's literally the only thing that you can hold on to, there's just something about that, that draws you closer to him.
I'll tell you something, this might sound kind of cliche, but Dad being gone has helped me to look more at God the Father as a father, because I no longer have one here, So instead of calling my dad for advice or just to tell him something good that's happened, I talked to God the Father about it.
Obviously, like, starting to date was really a weird kind of experience. But Daniel, every step of the way, has been just like so understanding. You know, he'll listen to me when I'm missing Patrick, or you know, especially when we got engaged and we were planning the wedding, and you know, it was all just kind of coming up, and he has been nothing but understanding, and you know, just has let me have my process over the past couple years. And he's definitely a godsend, and Daddy loves him, so that's positive.
I've told you before that my favorite attribute about God is that he's faithful. Is that he's always the same and he's never gonna leave. I think that's something that rarely do we experience as human beings and people. You don't see that. And I think maybe I rarely saw that too, just through, you know, my childhood and adulthood, and I love that attribute about God, that he's always gonna be there.
Jesus, take the beauty from the pain. Jesus, lift these weary hands again. Turn the silence into songs of praise. Jesus, I am leaning on your name. I'm leaning on you. I'm leaning on you. I'm leaning on you.
Andre and Micah, how much you appreciate them sharing. When I first reached out to Andre to ask if she'd be willing to share her story in this way, she wrote back and said, honestly, I decided long ago I would never turn down an opportunity for God to use my story. I prayed for those opportunities. If I don't find some kind of purpose in it, it just makes me bitter and angry, to be completely candid. So I'd be down for this. And then she said, also, that song is fire. But you see, both these incredible people are adamant about sharing the hardest seasons of their lives, because not only did God strengthen their faith through it, but there's a chance that through their pain it could cause someone else to find hope in God. God, who may not always deliver the way that we expect, but will always give purpose to the pain and deliver one way or another. So going back to our story, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they still got thrown to the fire, but it's what happened in the fire that changed everything. In verse 24, it says, but suddenly Nebuchadnezzar jumped up in amazement and exclaimed to his advisors, didn't we tie up 3 men and throw them in the furnace? Yes, your majesty, we did, they replied. Look, he shouted, I see 4 men, unbound, walking around in the fire unharmed, and the 4th looks like a god, like a son of the gods. See, don't miss this, because this is why James tells us to count it pure joy when we face trials of many kinds, because the testing of your faith produces perseverance. And a faith that is tested is a faith that can be trusted. And perseverance is found when we recognize the presence of God. And more often than not, you'll be able to recognize the tangible presence of God more in the fire than when things are easy and comfortable. You see, they went into the fire bound, but they were unbound in the fire. You see, we may go into the fire bound by fear or anxiety, insecurity, the pressure to perform. And we may find ourselves begging God to deliver us from the very thing that He's using to set us free from all those things that have been binding us for way too long. What if He uses the financial burdens to help us realize that He's our only true source of security? What if He uses the sickness to allow us to realize how fragile life is and focus on the healing of our soul? What if He uses the loss to make you realize how close He is and that you can never lose Him? Therefore, even if He doesn't deliver the way that we expected or the way that we asked, He's still good, because He's still there, and He's with you, and He's for you, and He's never changing, and He's never going away. What if God uses the fire you go through to strengthen you and to put the rest of the people around you on notice? See, look at what happens when those around see what happened in the fire. Verse 27, and the high officers, officials, governors, and advisors crowded around them and saw that the fire had not touched them. Not a hair on their head was singed, and their clothing was not scorched. They didn't even smell of smoke. And Nebuchadnezzar said, praise to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. There is no other God who can rescue like this. You see, I'm not saying you won't get burned. I'm not saying you won't get thrown to the fire, but I am here to tell you that the fire will not consume you, because you have a friend who sticks closer than a brother. You have a God who stands with you and for you, and you have a Savior standing right in the fire with you and promises to see you through, whether on this side of eternity or the next. And wouldn't it all be worth it if it caused at least one person to exclaim, there is no other God who can rescue like this? And so pray with me, with every head bowed and every eye closed, just for a moment of prayer and privacy. This is a moment between you and God. You can trust that Jesus will stand with you in the fire, because He went through the ultimate fire for you. Our sin and our selfishness and our desire to be our own God separated mankind from Him. And He said that without the shedding of blood, there would be no remission of sin. So God came to this planet in the person of Jesus Christ, lived a perfect life, died an unjust death in order to pay the price that our sin demanded. But then Jesus rose from the grave to give you and I the opportunity to receive the free gift of forgiveness and salvation. His word says that all who call upon the name of the Lord shall be saved. It says if you confess with your mouth that Jesus Christ is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, then you will be saved. You'll be welcomed into a relationship with him and secured a place in heaven when this momentary life is over. And with every head bowed and every eye closed, no matter where you are, if you're sitting here in this room or if you're watching at home in your living room or your kitchen, wherever you are, if you want to accept this free gift of salvation that he offers today, I want to ask that right where you are, you pray this prayer with me and say, Jesus, I know that I have sinned and I know that you died for me. I believe that God raised you from the dead and I accept you as Lord of my life. Give me a new heart. And from this day forward, I define my life by who you are and what you have done. Thank you for saving me. And with your head still bowed and your eyes still closed, I want to ask if you prayed that prayer today. Doesn't matter if you're in this room or sitting at home. I believe that whenever we respond physically on the outside, it just solidifies what God's doing on the inside. So if you prayed that prayer to accept Jesus today, I want to ask wherever you are with no one else looking around that you lift your hand to heaven wherever you are, saying, yes, Jesus, I accept you. Saying, yes, God, my life is yours. And if that's you, amen, I see your hand. And if that's you, I don't want you to leave this place today without telling anybody. If you would, there's cards on the gray boxes on the way out. You can grab one of those, fill out your information, check I gave my life to Christ, slide it in there. If you're at home, you can go on our website or our app, fill out a Connect card, check the box and say, I gave my life to Christ. We just want to be praying for you in this journey that you're on. And for the rest of us, no matter what life throws at us, we know that we can stand in the love of God because we know, because of who Jesus is and what he has done, he is standing right in the fire with you. Never leave you, never forsake you. No matter what the enemy tries to throw our way, no matter what a broken world comes to, he's with you, he's for you, he loves you, and he wants to show you more of himself. So Father, thank you so much for being such a good Father. Thank you that there is nowhere we can ever go to outrun your love. Thank you that there is nothing that the powers of hell or this world can throw at us that is greater than who you are and your love for us. So Lord, I pray for an army of believers that would stand in the truth of who you are. We would allow who you are and what you've done to define everything about our lives. I pray with every conversation, I pray with every step that we take, we would take our cue from you. And I pray what happens in this room wouldn't stay in this room, but we would go into our homes, into our schools, into our communities, into our workplaces, taking the power and the presence and the love of God with us. Thank you that we get to be your children. Thank you that no matter how hard things get on this side of eternity, we still have hope that that day will come, that you will wipe every tear from every eye, and we will stand blameless before a holy God, welcomed as your children. And Father, I pray if there's anyone who has not accepted that offer, they wouldn't leave this place today without giving everything over to you. Thank you for who you are. Thank you for who we get to be in you. Jesus, we love you. We love you. We love you. It's in your name we pray. Amen.